I need to speak to the pilot in command. The actual pilot, the words, slick with the unearned confidence of a man who had never been truly tested, cut through the low hum of the hangar. Lieutenant Commander Vance Corbin, call sign Viper, stood with his arms crossed, a perfect portrait of condescension. His flight suit was custom-tailored, adorned with the flashy patch of his elite squadron. The Sky Devils, he was flanked by two younger pilots, lieutenants who mirrored his posture and his smirk, eager to bask in the reflected glory of their leader. The small crowd of engineers and ground crew in the immediate vicinity fell silent, their gazes shifting nervously between the arrogant officer and the woman he was addressing. She hadn't even looked up. She remained focused on the datapad in her hands, her brow furrowed in concentration as she swiped through lines of telemetry data. Her flight suit was a standard-issue olive drab, worn and faded at the seams, devoid of any adornment save for a simple name tag that read Reed. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, practical bun, and the lines around her eyes spoke not of youth, but of countless hours spent staring into the unforgiving glare of the sun from behind a cockpit canopy. Corbin took her silence as disrespect. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with mock politeness, "this is the XR-7 Aurora, a $2 billion hypersonic asset. I appreciate the ground crew's diligence, but my team and I are scheduled for the final integration sim in 10 minutes. So if you could please find whoever is in charge, someone with a G-suit instead of a clipboard, we can get this show on the road." A few of the younger pilots snickered. The engineers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew who she was, but it wasn't their place to correct a decorated squadron leader, a man tipped for command, a man whose ego was as legendary as his piloting record. They simply lowered their heads and pretended to be busy with their tasks, leaving her isolated in the bubble of Corbin's contempt. But when General Marcus Thorne, watching from a secure feed in his office 3 blocks away, saw her stance, he leaned closer to his monitor. He saw the way she held the datapad, not with the casual grip of a technician, but with the steady, proprietary hands of a master craftsman examining their life's work. He saw the subtle, almost imperceptible way her weight was balanced on the balls of her feet, a pilot's posture, always ready for a sudden shift in momentum. And he saw the profound, unshakable calm that surrounded her like an invisible shield, a calm that absorbed Corbin's noisy arrogance and rendered impotent. The general knew that the hangar was about to become a classroom, and a painful lesson was about to be taught. If you believe that true authority is earned in silence and proven by action, type competence below. Major Evelyn Reed made a final notation on her datapad, her finger tracing a complex diagnostic tree that mapped the neural network of the experimental aircraft before her. She didn't acknowledge Corbin's escalating impatience. To do so would be to give it credence, to admit that his frantic energy had any bearing on the meticulous life-or-death calculus of pre-flight checks. The air in the hangar was thick with the smells of ozone, hydraulic fluid, and chilled liquid oxygen, a sterile perfume that she had come to associate with the razor's edge of aerospace innovation. The XR-7 Aurora itself was less an aircraft and more a shard of obsidian night sky, given form. Its composite skin, a seamless matte black, absorbed the overhead lights, creating a pocket of darkness in the brightly lit cavern of the hangar. It had no visible cockpit, no windows, only a series of faint lines that hinted at sensor arrays and control surfaces. It was designed to fly at the very edge of space, a ghost that could map a continent in the time it took a commercial airliner to reach cruising altitude. It was a machine of impossible capabilities, and it demanded a pilot of impossible skill. Corbin, unable to tolerate being ignored, stepped closer, invading her personal space. "Look, I don't know who you are, but I'm the lead pilot for this integration. That means this multi-billion-dollar piece of hardware," he said, gesturing dismissively at the Aurora, "is my responsibility. My team has been training for this for 18 months. We're the best of the best. We are not going to have our final certification delayed because some civilian contractor is triple-checking the fuel gauges." He saw the name tag. "Reed, is that it? Well, Reed, the adults are here now. Go fetch some coffee and let the real pilots handle the important work." The insult was so direct, so dripping with sexist and ageist prejudice, that even his own wingmen shifted uncomfortably. The ground crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant with 30 years of service, made a move to step forward, his face a thundercloud of indignation, but a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of the head from Reed stopped him in his tracks. She finally looked up from her datapad, her eyes, a pale, piercing blue, meeting Corbin's for the first time. They were utterly devoid of emotion. Not anger, not fear, not indignation. It was the calm, analytical gaze of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. She offered no defense, no explanation, no protest. She simply pressed a final confirmation button on her screen, and the datapad chimed softly. "Pre-flight diagnostic complete," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the tension. "All systems are green. The simulator is ready for you." Commander, her utter lack of reaction was more unnerving to Corbin than any shouted retort could have been. It was a silence that held a mirror up to his own blustering insecurity, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of doubt crossed his face before his arrogance reasserted itself. He scoffed, turning away from her and striding toward the simulator control room as if he had won a great victory. "About time," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's see if this thing can keep up with a real pilot." The simulator control room was a state-of-the-art amphitheater of technology, a darkened space dominated by a massive, wraparound screen that displayed the world from the Aurora's perspective. Corbin settled into the command chair, a throne of ergonomic mesh and polished metal, flanked by his two wingmen at their own stations. A handful of senior engineers and the ground crew chief stood observing from the back, their faces tense. Major Reed entered quietly, taking a position at a small, unassuming auxiliary console in the corner, the same datapad now docked and glowing with supplementary readouts that only she seemed to be monitoring. Corbin, feeling magnanimous in his perceived victory, threw a comment over his shoulder. "Stay and watch, Reed. You might learn something about how we fly on the Sharp," and the simulation began. The panoramic screen flickered to life, showing a flawless ascent through a hyper-realistic sky. Corbin was undeniably skilled. His hands moved with fluid precision over the controls, his commands to his wingmen crisp and authoritative. For 30 minutes, the exercise went perfectly. The Aurora, under his command, performed a series of complex high-altitude reconnaissance maneuvers, dodging simulated threats and gathering intelligence data with textbook efficiency. Corbin was relaxed, confident, even cracking jokes over the comms. He was putting on a performance for the audience, a demonstration of his effortless mastery. And then, without warning, the world fell apart. A klaxon blared through the control room, and red warning lights began to flash across every screen. Multiple system failure. Multiple system failure. A synthesized voice announced, cold and robotic. Engine 1 flameout. Cascade failure in primary avionics. Flight control surfaces unresponsive. On the main screen, the simulated Aurora began to tumble, dropping from the stratosphere in a terrifying, unrecoverable flat spin. The perfect blue sky was replaced by a dizzying gyre of earth and clouds. Corbin's confidence evaporated instantly, replaced by a frantic, desperate energy. "Stabilize. Deploy emergency surfaces," he yelled, his knuckles white as he wrestled with the dead controls. "Why aren't they responding? Reroute auxiliary power to the hydrostatics." His wingmen were equally panicked, their voices rising in pitch as they reported their own systems failing. The engineers in the back muttered to each other, shaking their heads. This was the Reaper's scenario, a secret, unwinnable simulation designed by the program's architects to test a pilot's psychological limits in the face of certain failure. The only correct response was to eject. Corbin, his face beaded with sweat, his arrogance shattered, was about to do just that. His hand hovered over the glowing yellow button on his console. "It's no good," he breathed, his voice a ragged whisper of defeat. "She's a tomb. We're punching out." He was about to give the order to admit defeat in front of everyone he had tried so desperately to impress. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the inevitable admission of failure, the final surrender to a challenge designed to be insurmountable. In the corner of the room, Major Reed had not moved. She had not flinched at the alarms, nor had her expression changed at the sight of the catastrophic failure. While Corbin and his team were consumed by the chaos, she was a pool of absolute stillness. Her eyes, which had been scanning her private readouts, now fixed on the main screen, her gaze sharp and analytical. She saw not a dying aircraft, but a complex physics problem. She saw not a flat spin, but a set of variables: altitude, velocity, atmospheric density, and the remaining, flickering embers of the drone's secondary systems. Corbin's hand was still frozen over the eject button, his pride warring with the undeniable reality of his failure. "It's over," he said, more to himself than anyone else. No one could pull out of that. It was then that Reed's fingers began to move. She didn't touch the primary flight controls. Instead, she began typing a rapid series of commands into her auxiliary console, her movements economical and precise, like a concert pianist playing a familiar piece. On a small diagnostic screen visible only from her station, lines of code scrolled past at an impossible speed. She was bypassing the fried primary avionics, manually rerouting microbursts of power from the environmental control systems directly to the individual maneuvering thrusters, tiny jets normally used for minute orbital adjustments. It was a technique that existed only in theory, a desperate, last-ditch maneuver considered far too complex and unstable for any human pilot to execute. On the main screen, something impossible happened. Just as the Aurora was about to break apart from the aerodynamic stress, one of the wingtips gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shudder. A small puff of vapor, a thruster firing for a fraction of a second. Then another on the opposite side. Reed was playing the thrusters like a musical instrument, using asymmetrical bursts of force to fight the spin. It wasn't flying. It was a controlled fall, a brutal, ugly ballet of desperation and genius. Slowly, agonizingly, the terrifying spin began to slow. The dizzying blur of earth and sky began to resolve into distinct images. Reed's hands flew across her console, orchestrating the chaos, forcing the dying machine to obey her will. She used the damaged engine cowling as an air brake, deployed a single landing gear to create drag, and bled off velocity in a series of bone-jarring, unconventional maneuvers that defied every page of the flight manual. The room was utterly silent, save for the hum of the computers and the sound of Reed's rhythmic keystrokes. Every eye was glued to the screen, watching a miracle unfold. Corbin had lowered his hand from the eject button, his mouth hanging open in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. He was watching someone fly without wings, without controls, without hope. He was watching a ghost command machine. The ground rushed up to meet them, but the fall was no longer a spin. It was a steep, terrifying, but somehow controlled glide. With a final, perfectly timed series of thruster bursts, Reed brought the nose up just moments before impact. The Aurora slammed onto the simulated runway, not with the grace of a landing, but with the controlled violence of a survivor. It skidded, shedding sparks and debris, but it held together. It slid to a halt at the very end of the tarmac, battered but intact. A moment of absolute, deafening silence hung in the air. Then, in bright green letters, the words appeared on the screen: "Mission successful. Asset recovered." The silence in the control room stretched for an eternity. It was a heavy, profound quiet, broken only by the gentle whir of cooling fans. The simulation's final message, "Asset recovered," glowed with an almost accusatory brilliance. No one moved. No one spoke. The team of engineers stared at the screen, their expressions a mixture of awe and confusion, as if they had just witnessed a violation of the laws of physics. Corbin's two wingmen looked from a screen to their leader, their faces pale with shock. They had been trained by the best, drilled in every conceivable emergency procedure, but what they had just seen was not in any textbook. It was something else entirely, a feat of airmanship that bordered on the supernatural. Lieutenant Commander Vance Corbin remained frozen in his command chair. The swagger, the arrogance, the loud certainty. It had all been stripped away, leaving behind a hollow shell of disbelief. His eyes were wide, fixed on the image of the battered but whole XR-7 on the runway. He replayed the final moments in his mind. The spin, the impossible recovery, the landing. His own training, his instincts, his entire career had screamed at him that it was over, that the only option was to eject. He had been ready to sacrifice the $2 billion prototype. Yet this quiet, unassuming woman in a plain flight suit had wrestled it from the jaws of death with nothing but a keyboard and an inhuman calm. "No," he whispered, the sound barely audible. "No way. That's not possible." He turned in his chair, his gaze finally finding Reed in the corner of the room. She was no longer at her console. She was standing, calmly docking her datapad into its charging station as if she had just finished a routine inventory check. Her face was serene, betraying no sign of the immense mental strain she must have been under. "The physics are wrong," Corbin stammered, his voice cracking. "The simulation must be bugged. No pilot can manually fire maneuvering thrusters with that kind of precision. It's not humanly possible." He was grasping at straws, trying to find a logical explanation that would preserve his own worldview, a world where he was the apex predator of the skies. The idea that someone, especially this woman he had so casually dismissed, could possess a skill so far beyond his own was a foundation-shattering concept. The door to the control room hissed open, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. Every person in the room, from the junior engineers to Corbin himself, snapped to a rigid posture of attention. General Marcus Thorne stepped into the room, his 4-star rank radiating an aura of quiet, absolute authority. He was a tall, lean man in his late 60s, with a face that seemed carved from granite and eyes that had seen everything from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the wars in the desert. He didn't acknowledge the salutes or the rigid postures. His gaze swept across the room, taking in the shocked faces, the glowing screen, and finally settling on Lieutenant Commander Corbin. Thorne walked not to Corbin, but to the main engineering console. His boots made no sound on the polished floor. The lead engineer, a man with a PhD in aerospace dynamics, seemed to shrink in the general's presence. "Son," Thorne said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commanded obedience. "Pull up the pilot's service jacket for Major Reed." Authorization Thorne Omega-7. The engineer's eyes widened at the authorization code. Omega-7 was a designation reserved for the highest levels of national security, a key that unlocked the deepest, most hidden secrets of the military's personnel files. He turned to his keyboard, his fingers flying across the keys with a newfound urgency. A moment later, a file appeared on the main screen, the one everyone had been watching. Most of it was redacted, vast fields of black rectangles labeled classified. But what was visible was enough to suck the remaining air from the room. The narrator's voice seemed to echo the stark, staccato text on the screen. Name, Reed, Evelyn M. Rank, Major. Call sign, Ghost. A murmur went through the room. Ghost, not a call sign from a fighter squadron, but a name whispered in the intelligence community, a legend attached to missions that never officially happened. Flight hours, 12,478. Corbin's own impressive 3,000 hours suddenly seemed paltry, the experience of a novice. Combat sorti, classified. Test pilot school, Edwards AFB, top graduate, class of '08. Recipient of the David C. Schilling Award for Outstanding Contribution to Flight Testing. The list went on. Medals. Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 oak leaf clusters. The Silver Star. The Legion of Merit. The Purple Heart. Each award represented an act of valor, a moment of extreme pressure where she had not broken. Current assignment. Director of Flight Operations, Advanced Development Programs. Project Lead, XR-7 Aurora. She wasn't just a pilot for the program. She was the pilot, the chief, the final authority. The screen showed a final line under special qualifications, followed by more black rectangles. But next to one, a single entry was visible. Creator of the Cascade Recovery Maneuver. General Thorne turned away from the screen, his movements slow and deliberate. He faced Major Reed, who had remained standing quietly by her station. In front of the entire room, the cocky pilots, the humbled engineers, the stunned commander. The four-star general snapped to the most formal parade ground salute, his hand cutting the air with a precision that spoke of a lifetime of discipline. "Major Reed," he said, his voice resonating with a profound and unmistakable respect. "On behalf of the United States Air Force, I apologize for the unprofessional reception you received today. Your reputation, as always, is outmatched only by your performance." General Thorne held his salute for a long, deliberate moment, a public and undeniable gesture of deference from one of the most powerful men in the military to the quiet professional he had just vindicated. Evelyn Reed returned the salute with a crisp, economical motion, her expression unchanged. There was no hint of triumph in her eyes, no satisfaction at Corbin's humiliation. There was only the calm, steady focus of a professional who had completed a task. Thorne lowered his hand and turned, his gaze now falling upon Lieutenant Commander Corbin like a physical weight. Corbin, who had risen from his chair, looked as if he had been struck. The color had drained from his face, and his confident posture had collapsed into a rigid, uncertain stance. "Lieutenant Commander Corbin," Thorne began, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "You asked to see the pilot in command. You're looking at her. You questioned her authority. You mocked her presence. You assumed that competence comes in a package that fits your narrow, prejudiced worldview." He took a step closer, his eyes boring into Corbin's. "Let me tell you who you just insulted. In 2015, over an undisclosed location in Syria, two F-22 Raptors were struck by a new generation of surface-to-air missile. One pilot ejected. The other, with his flight controls shredded and his aircraft in a fatal spin, was Major Reed. She was the flight lead. She refused to eject from an aircraft carrying sensitive technology. What you just witnessed on that screen, the maneuver you called impossible, was not a simulation for her. She invented it in real time while bleeding from a piece of shrapnel in her shoulder and talking her own ground crew through the physics of what she was doing. They call it the Reed Cascade at the Academy now. She saved a $200 million aircraft and its classified intelligence package. More importantly, she is the reason I was able to attend the wedding of the young pilot who was her wingman that day. A pilot you, Commander, have never even met. The general let the story hang in the air, its significance settling on everyone in the room. The engineers and crew, who had only known Reed as a quiet, demanding but fair project lead, now looked at her with a newfound, almost reverent awe. Corbin's wingmen stared at the floor, their faces burning with shame for their complicity. "Major Reed didn't just graduate from test pilot school," Thorne continued, his voice relentless. "She has been the lead test pilot on every major stealth and hypersonic program for the last decade. She has more hours flying black projects than your entire squadron has in conventional aircraft. She wrote the flight manual for the Aurora. She designed the very simulation that you just failed. She is not here to learn from you, Commander. You are here, if you are very, very lucky, to learn from her. You will address her as Major or Ma'am. You will extend to her the professional courtesy and respect that her rank and her experience command. Is that understood?" Corbin could only manage a choked, barely audible whisper. "Yes, General." Crystal clear, he looked at Major Reed, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a woman or a technician, but as a legend. And in her calm, unwavering gaze, he saw not anger, but an immense, terrifying, and humbling standard he could never hope to meet. The story of what happened in Simulator Room 3 spread through the base like a shockwave. It traveled not through official channels, but through the military's oldest and most reliable communication network, gossip. It was whispered over greasy tables in the mess hall, recounted in hushed tones in maintenance bays, and debated in the smoky confines of the off-base bars where pilots gathered. The tale grew with each telling, acquiring the burnished patina of legend. They called it the Day of the Ghost. The details were embellished. Some said the simulation had thrown 3 engine failures at her, others that she had landed the drone blindfolded. But the core of the story remained unchanged. The quiet, unassuming Major had, in the space of 5 minutes, humbled the loudest mouth on the base and performed a feat of flying that bordered on magic. Lieutenant Commander Corbin's call sign, Viper, became a source of mockery. For weeks, he'd find clipboards left anonymously on his locker, in his cockpit, on his desk. It was a cruel but effective reminder of his arrogance. But the public humiliation was secondary to the profound internal shift occurring within him. The incident had been a crucible, burning away the dross of his ego and forcing him to confront the vastness of his own ignorance. He was formally reprimanded by General Thorne, a black mark on his otherwise perfect record, but the general's words were the real punishment, echoing in his mind every time he stepped onto the flight line. A week after the incident, Corbin found Major Reed in the base library, of all places. She was seated at a small table, surrounded by dense textbooks on quantum mechanics and fluid dynamics. She was not reviewing flight data. She was studying, learning, pushing her own boundaries even further. He approached her table hesitantly, his usual confidence completely gone. He stood there for a long moment before she looked up, her blue eyes as calm and analytical as ever. "Major," he began, his voice quiet, stripped of all its former bluster. I wanted to apologize. My conduct was unprofessional, arrogant, and inexcusable. There's no other way to say it. I was wrong." Reed simply looked at him, waiting. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a patient silence that demanded honesty. "What you did in that simulator," he trailed off, shaking his head. "I've reviewed the data 100 times. I still don't understand how it's possible. I was hoping, if you had the time, you might be willing to walk me through the sequence. I want to learn." He expected a dismissal, a curt rejection. He had, after all, publicly insulted her. Instead, Major Reed closed her textbook, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. 800 hours. "My office. Thursday," she said. "Bring a datapad and a fresh perspective." The first lesson is that the plane doesn't care about your ego. In that simple act of mentorship, she demonstrated the true nature of her strength. It wasn't about being better than others. It was about making everyone around her better. Her competence wasn't a weapon to be wielded against others, but a tool to build them up. Corbin nodded, a wave of relief and gratitude washing over him. "Yes, ma'am," he said, the words now filled with a genuine and profound respect. "Thank you." The ripple effects of that day extended far beyond the personal humbling of one arrogant pilot. The legend of Major Ghost Reed became institutionalized. The full sensor telemetry and flight data from her impossible simulation run were declassified for training purposes. At the Air Force Academy and the elite test pilot school at Edwards, the Reed Cascade became a mandatory subject of study. Instructors would play the recording for rooms full of young, ambitious pilots, the best and brightest of their generation. They would watch in stunned silence as the simulation unfolded, witnessing the catastrophic failure and the subsequent, miraculous recovery. The lesson wasn't just about the technical aspects of the maneuver. It was a powerful parable about the nature of expertise. "Look at her hands," an instructor would say, pausing the video on a close-up of Reed's fingers on the auxiliary console. "No guasti motion." Look at her biometrics on the side display. Her heart rate is barely elevated. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what mastery looks like. It's not loud. It's not flashy. It is calm, quiet, and absolute. The framed data printout of the Aurora's flight path during the spin and recovery was mounted on a wall of honor in the main briefing room at Edwards Air Force Base. It was a chaotic, jagged line of red ink that slowly, impossibly, resolved into a straight, clean line on the runway. It hung next to black and white photos of legends like Chuck Yeager and Neil Armstrong. There was no photo of Reed next to it, at her specific request. There was only a simple brass plaque beneath the printout. It read, "The Reed Cascade. Attitude is the difference between a spin and a controlled descent." Major Reed herself remained as elusive as her call sign suggested. She deflected all praise, turning down interview requests from military journals and avoiding ceremonies held in her honor. When a young lieutenant, emboldened by the story, asked her how she stayed so calm under pressure, she gave a simple, direct answer. "I don't have time to be scared," she said. Fear is a luxury. In a crisis, there are only two things: the problem and the solution. Focus on the problem, and you'll find the solution. focus on anything else, and you become part of the problem. Her philosophy of quiet competence began to permeate the culture of the base. Young pilots started talking less about kill ratios and G-forces and more about precision, control, and understanding the machine. The loudest voices in the briefing rooms were no longer the most respected. Instead, everyone started paying a little more attention to the quiet ones, the observers, the thinkers wondering what hidden depths of skill they might be concealing. The lesson had been learned. Assumptions were dangerous, and true respect was earned not with words, but with undeniable, irrefutable competence. A year passed. The XR-7 Aurora program, under Major Reed's continued quiet guidance, had moved from simulation to successful atmospheric flight testing, breaking every record for speed and altitude. She remained a figure of immense respect, a living embodiment of the standard to which all others aspired, though she was still rarely seen outside the classified confines of the project. The most significant legacy of her actions, however, was not in the hangar, but in the briefing rooms of the conventional fighter squadrons. Lieutenant Commander Vance Corbin stood before a new squadron of young pilots, F-35 jockeys fresh from training, brimming with the same unchecked confidence he once possessed. But Corbin was a different man. The flashy Viper patch was gone from his flight suit, replaced by the standard, subdued squadron insignia. His voice was calmer, his posture less aggressive, his eyes more observant. He was briefing them for a complex, high-risk mission over the Arctic, a patrol designed to test their abilities under extreme weather conditions. He clicked a button, and the main screen behind him changed from a satellite map to the jagged, red-ink data printout of the Reed Cascade. A few of the new pilots looked confused. Before we discuss flight plans, Corbin said, his voice steady and authoritative, we're going to discuss humility. We're going to talk about the most dangerous thing you bring with you into a cockpit. It's not a faulty engine or an enemy missile. It's your ego. He then told them the story. He didn't spare himself, recounting his own arrogance, his condescending words, and his utter failure in the simulator. He told them about the quiet major in the plain flight suit, the woman he had dismissed as a technician, and the impossible feat of airmanship she had performed. He described the deafening silence of the control room, the weight of General Thorne's disappointment, and the profound, life-altering lesson he had learned that day. I assumed I knew what excellence looked like, Corbin told the rapt audience of young pilots. I thought it was loud and confident. I was wrong. Excellence was quiet. It was focused. It was standing in the corner of the room, doing the work while everyone else was posturing. The most skilled person I have ever met in my life never once told me how good she was. She just showed me. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each pilot. When you're out there, check your assumptions at the door. The quietest person on your comms channel might be the one with the answer. The unassuming maintenance chief who gives you a warning about a sensor might be saving your life. Listen more than you talk. Respect the skill, not the swagger. Competence is the only currency that matters at 30,000 feet. That is the lesson Major Ghost Reed taught me. It's the most important lesson you will ever learn. He had become the carrier of her legacy, spreading her philosophy of quiet professionalism to the next generation. The true measure of a legacy is not found in monuments of stone or in lines of text in a history book. It is found in the living, breathing actions of those who come after. Major Evelyn Reed never sought to become a legend. She never asked for her name to be whispered with reverence in the halls of the Air Force Academy. She simply showed up every day and performed her duties to a standard that she set for herself, a standard that existed on a plane far beyond the comprehension of most. Her influence was not in a single dramatic moment of vindication, but in the slow, steady cultural shift that followed. Pilots became better listeners. Engineers felt more empowered to speak up. The entire institution, in its own small way, began to value the quiet professional as much as the decorated warrior. The story of the ghost in the machine became a foundational myth for new recruits, a touchstone used to teach the core values of the service. Integrity, service before self, and excellence in all we do. It was a reminder that true authority isn't claimed with a loud voice or a chest full of medals. It is granted in the silent, astonished respect of those who witness undeniable skill. It is not found on a shoulder board or a name tag, but in the steady, practiced hands that can guide a falling star back to the safety of the earth. Legacy isn't about what you accomplish for yourself. It's about the standards you inspire in others. It's about the lessons that live on long after you have flown your final sortie. Major Reed never sought respect. She simply created a professional gravity so immense that respect was the only possible natural response. Her silence was never a sign of weakness. It was the calm at the center of the storm, the quiet confidence of a master who had nothing left to prove. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent action defines a hero's worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.